Good evening. Massively happy New Year to everybody. Hope you all had a good one. Marvellous. Okay, kicking off 2018, we have Tony Wright. I first saw Ian Crane's AV8. Tonight, author Tony presents Children of the Forest. It takes an intimate and historical look at humans and our relationships with certain food and their effects upon us in our evolution. Tony also brings his book, Return to the Brain of Eden, which is 20 years in the making. Please welcome Tony Wright.
Just get my toys sorted out. Okay, thanks for coming. Thanks, Rob, for the invite. So, what am I going to talk about this evening? You can see from the title, it's kind of quite a big question, and I hope I'm going to provide you with some interesting information. I'm not going to tell you answers, but I'm going to try and, I guess, suggest what I've discovered over the last 20-25 years to do. Really, it's about, I suppose, why humanity has gone insane. And I've really been looking at fundamental causes. What is it right down in the basement that drives what appears to be our increasing self-destructive behavior, and what has resulted really in the social systems we have, the political institutions we have, all the kind of things that we get pretty cheesed off about. I'm really looking as to how that has emerged, how we've ended up here. And some of the things I'm going to suggest might initially not really seem that relevant. They might not make much sense, because I'm going to cover quite a sort of broad area and then hopefully bring it to some kind of conclusion towards the end. So it might be a case of just holding on to the pieces, and then hopefully towards the end, some of them at least might fit together with any luck. So, as I say, pretty grand questions. This is really what I've been more or less obsessed with for the last 20 odd years. Who are we? What are we? Very old questions, very ancient questions. And I do draw on quite a lot of what might be called ancient mythology, ancient traditions. But I've also tried to marry it up with modern Western academic tradition. I think there's a lot of really good data there. I'm not always so inspired by the conclusions. But it is a mixture of different traditions, and I actually think they tell the same story once you step back and ask perhaps slightly different questions. And in essence, I'm really trying to develop what I would call a diagnosis as the first step towards trying to treat what I'm kind of proposing is species-wide insanity. It's not just at the very top of the hierarchy of madness, but really, if we're honest, I think we can all see unusual aspects of our own psychology, our own behavior. We see it more easily in other people, but of course everybody thinks exactly the same about us. And it's always a little bit uncomfortable to look in the mirror. So I'm going to start with a little bit of, I guess, a conclusion, and suggest that you test this against the information I'm going to work through, present over the next hour or two, and see how it fits. But I think it's sometimes helpful to get an idea of ultimately what I'm trying to say, and then you can see how the pieces fit together. And I am going to draw a little bit on something you're probably quite familiar with, classic left-right brain material, been around for quite a long time now, certainly 40, 50 years, even longer. And I think there's some absolutely fascinating material in there. It's been somewhat eroded over the last 10 to 20 years. There's been a suggestion, or quite a lot written in sort of mainstream publications, that it's not that simple, it doesn't work like that, based on modern imaging data. But actually the modern imaging data, the way it's been interpreted, I think is highly suspect. I think there is a real story here. It's as simple as it was in the early experiments in the 50s, 60s and 70s. I've even got a bit of footage if we've got time to show you. See how we get on. Can you read that? Is that legible at the back?
Yeah.
So I'll just give you a little minute to read that, and then we'll start getting into the various areas that I think relate to this, some of which, as I say, might seem a bit unusual, and then hopefully start pulling it together. I'm essentially saying the dominant part of our character, the dominant part of our psychology, the kind of I we normally relate to, our normal sense of self, the neurology that underpins that has some quite serious problems. But because that's what we're bound to, that's kind of the filter we always look through, we tend not to see the problems, we tend to look outward and see the symptoms. Also going to try and weave in a little bit of classic Darwinian evolution, really looking at human origins. Again, I think there's a lot of interesting data, and I actually think it fits a lot of the ancient mythology quite well. Again, once you step back and look at the bigger picture. And just dwelling on this slide, the kind of current thinking, kind of coming out of the Western academic tradition, is that our distant ancestors spent a huge amount of time in the forest, tens of millions of years, didn't really get up to much, nothing much interesting happened there. And then as we emerged from the forest, somehow by means not fully understood as yet, we developed a very large brain and intelligence, and then went on to create civilization. So sort of moving from this through all these wonderful inventions, and we end up with allegedly the sort of pinnacle of civilization. Kind of an obsession with rockets and big shiny buildings, and you see the scale change. This is kind of the human scale now, and we're in awe of what we've created. That's the story we're told anyway. And our culture, especially the last 50, 60, 70 years, has gone into overdrive. More and more technology, and we're almost digitizing ourselves. And the story again, at least what the ad men tell us, it's fantastic, it's more, it's better, it's faster, it's quicker. Of course, within all of this story, there's massive kind of, I suppose, I wouldn't say, it's more like denial really, things that don't fit. And most of the culture that we're encouraged to aspire to is still built on slavery, has been for a long time. And the supply chains, you don't have to go very far down the supply chains for the stuff that we all buy and use every day to find modern equivalent. Incredible poverty, incredibly difficult lives. And our culture relies on this to survive. So I'm really just pointing out the obvious stuff you're already familiar with, but I think it's worth a quick reminder. The juxtaposition between this idea that we're advanced and everything's okay, and these difficult to explain anomalies. Obviously, warfare has been a significant part of human history for at least the last few thousand years. And in modern times, I think we've killed at least 100 million of our own kind in the last 100 years or so. And some of our best technology tends to come out of the military research. We've ended up investing huge amounts of resource to invent ever more efficient ways to kill each other. And we kind of know this, but it's so embedded in our culture, it tends to just slip under the radar a bit. In fact, most Western economies are propped up by defense contracts, defense industry. So the idea that we're advanced and functional, to me, is, well, these clues are just so massive, but we're so used to them. And then even within the midst of, again, allegedly the sort of pinnacle of Western culture, these giant cities, you don't have to look very far to see how much of a failure they are. And again, looking at the human element, we get carried away, or our dominant psychology gets carried away with the shiny, big, square things. I mean, there was probably forest there 200-300 years ago, and look what we've done to the place. I think that's supposed to be a major American city. And when you actually speak to people, of course, the story is very different. Things aren't quite so rosy. The actual harsh reality is, after years of this culture that's promised so much, the reality is, if anything, it's getting worse. It's more stressful, confusion, absolute epidemic of degenerative diseases. Really isn't working as well as it's supposed to. It's nothing like what it says on the box. Now, before the kind of advent of Western science, our natural history, our ideas of who and what we are, came down to us in various traditions. Ancient oral traditions, some of those have been distorted and lost, particularly in this part of the world. Some of them still exist in partially intact forms. And then some of that's been codified and it's been brought into the idea of modern religions, but they still tell similar stories. The ancient mythology of mankind has parallels in some of these great religions. And the story's interesting. The common theme is that at one time we were very different to what we are now. And I don't mean physically necessarily, I mean the way we perceive ourselves, the way we would describe ourselves. And they generally allude to a time where, in fact, things weren't just a little bit better, they were phenomenally better. Talk about a time where we really experienced a sense of connection with nature and with each other. And we were in a state of almost divine wonder. That was our kind of normal state. Sounds a little bit fluffy, sounds a bit of a hippie sort of ideology, but when we start looking at the biochemistry in a bit, it does actually start to add up. And these same traditions, some of them are quite detailed, some are a bit more vague. They talk about this time changing because of some kind of disaster, some kind of, often an ecological disaster, but some kind of major upset. And things began to change, our perception began to change. We began to see the emergence of a sense of self that we'd start to recognize today. So there's this ancient sense of self, this, again, I'm using the word, I guess, divine, but not in any particular religious sense. Just a very heightened state, a very kind of wondrous state in many ways, often described as a very innocent time. That sense of self began to retract, and this new sense of self began to emerge. And they seem to coexist for a long time, again, according to these traditions. And then eventually, this new self began to completely dominate, and we lost connection with this more ancient self, or it became very hard to experience.